And one important message that you need to know is that your brain has two fuel sources. It has a glucose fuel and it has a ketone fuel. So in my little videos, I use these red squares as a way to point out glucose. It's not an accident that the glucose here is happy, because glucose does give us energy. But then there's two other guys with that glucose that are kind of grumpy or tired, and one that's even fallen asleep. If you kind of look closer at some of the other images, there's an irritable one, there's a crabby one, there's a brain that's not working right. So I use that word glucose. And then I use these to represent ketones. Again, all three of these ketones are filled with energy. Their eyes are wide open, they're bright blue, and they're working together. They're not separate. So when you look at ketones and how they fuel your body, not just your brain, it is a much longer, deeper, continuous fuel. And there are lots of positive things that come from using ketones as a fuel. It just takes time to do that. So as I was testing this message out on my kids, I instantly realized that I'm using the word glucose, and that means I expect everybody to know where glucose comes from. And that was my first mistake. Glucose is a wonderful word, and I use it all the time, but what I'm really saying is when you look at glucose, glucose is the sugar energy, the carbohydrate energy that's floating around in your blood. And if you look at the smattering of words here, the kind of foods that give you carbohydrates all are filled with your attention on the food pyramid. So for instance, the carbohydrates found in granola bars sound really healthy, and I gave those to my kids for years. I gave them bran muffins, I fed them milk, I gave them yogurt, I gave them other cereals, I had salad, I did not give them wine, but bread, oatmeal, ice cream, desserts, ketchup, beans, potatoes, bananas. Bananas have a very good marketing team. Their sugar source is really quick, and everybody looks at a banana and says they're healthy. The carrots are very much a high carbohydrate vegetable, and many of the vegetables that we eat become so processed and get cooked so much that they're more carbohydrate than anything else. And as much as when I say glucose, I'm thinking of all of these foods in my mind, and I expect the advanced people in a ketogenic diet to be able to connect those. I think my kids are kind of advanced when it comes to a ketogenic diet, and when they struggled to get some of these answers right, I knew I had to back up a little bit and make sure that everybody knows that Holsteins are where cows come from. Ketones are again, something I think everybody knows where ketones come from. Ketones are, again, this energy source that we find in our system, and they come from fat. Now, as your body gets keto adapted, I want that fat to be the fat that's found in your love handles, the fat that's found in your tummy, the fat that's found around your heart. But at first, we need our bodies to be eating fat to shift the chemistry. So when I say ketones, and I talk about the food that goes with ketones, these are the kinds of foods that I think everybody should jump to the conclusion of. Whether that's sour cream, fatty fish, chicken wings, as long as you eat the skin, because there's a lot of fat with that, sardines in oil. You're never going to see me skip an opportunity to promote liverwurst, because it is a great resource. My kids have had their daily dose or weekly dose of liverwurst this week. Butter, bacon, ribs, as long as there's not a lot of sauce on it, so a dry rub for your ribs. The oils that you use to cook with, but make sure they're not seed oils. Most of the seed oils out there, I have far too many inflammatory type of fats. So, the most seedy oil that I think of is an avocado. But lard, tallow, mayonnaise, be sure to look at the labels that the mayonnaise comes with low carbs. And of course, then there's the ever popular egg, been around for thousands of years and been on the human diet for so long that the test of time wins out, even if there's been a recent article saying, hey, eggs are bad for you. Be careful, time wins. All right, so here's our brain. Here's our unhealthy brain that is wimpy. And when I look at the kind of brains that, when I see that image as a physician running a clinic for 20 years, the people in my mind that circulate include several of these words. I think of patients with memory problems. I think of patients with ADHD, with an irritable mood, those who've had seizures, tremors, headaches, migraines. Maybe they can't seem to do math in their head anymore. Maybe they have Parkinson's. Maybe they can't focus. Some of them have anxiety, depression, concentration injuries, or concentration problems, and brain injuries. They've just had a concussion and their brain is swollen. They've had excessive sugars in their brain and their brain is swollen. They're alcoholic and their brain is swollen. So I think of brain injuries. But when I see that slumpy, irritable brain, I instantly think of what happens, of the patients behind the stories of brains that aren't working well. All right, so let's get back to our brains having two sources of fuel. So here's the brain that we want to have, this nice, happy, pink, cheerful, concentrating, focused, nicely sleeping and waking energy kind of brain. The studies that we're going to talk about have to do with this brain that has both ketones and glucose floating around your circulation. So in this blood vessel here, you can see those red blood cells circulating, but you can also see our glucose squares in the circulation, and you can see ketones in the circulation. So if we go into brains, it is a unique part of our body where the brain cannot take fat and make ketones. It can use ketones for fuel, but it cannot make ketones out of fat. So it's one of the few places in the body that can't happen. The liver is the superstar when it comes to making ketones, but the blood-brain barrier, which is the difference between that blood that's floating there and the brain, there are several protective mechanisms in our body to keep what's in circulation out of our brain. And we have lots of energy and science put into studying what ends up in our brains. So this is part of the area at the blood-brain barrier that shows how glucose uses something called a glucose transporter to go from circulation into our brains. Now, I might be using lingo there again. I might be using jargon, words that don't mean what I think they should mean to you. So jargon of glucose transporter is at the blood-brain barrier, the glucose can't just slide across. It is protected. That blood-brain barrier will take the glucose, lift it over the blood-brain barrier, and put it into the brain. And the job of the transporter that does that, it is that's why our blood glucose never really drops below like 45 or 50 without our brain saying, hey, I just don't have enough glucose to feed the brain. So looking at a steady supply of glucose for those little folks at the blood-brain barrier to lift them over the fence and take them out of circulation and put them into the brain. But the other very important thing that's been studied is that there are ketone transporters. And so that MC transporter, not to be mistaken for MCT oil, it's like monocarboxylic transporter or something, but that's the name of the transporter that takes the ketones and pushes them into the brain. Again, a very regulated process, and when there's ketones around, that little transporter is very busy and does a really efficient job of supplying the brain with ketones. All right, so we are looking at the brains with the most disease. So I showed you all that list of brains a minute ago of people who have low energy, they have Parkinson's, they have tremors, they have brains that aren't working right, they have anxiety, they have depression. If you go back to what happened to Lachlan when she first started this consult, her brain wasn't working right. That's the beauty of why her story is so powerful to me, is that her sugars were 300, people. Her brain was swollen. She couldn't focus very long. And she's a single mom with 2 kids. She needs someone to help her get her brain working right. So in order to teach what happened with Lachlan's brain, I'm going to use some of the most diseased brains out there, which are Alzheimer's brains. The Alzheimer's brains are very old, very damaged in this situation. I want you to know that the brains have they are going to show how glucose fails them, but the ketones prevailed. So let's start with, we're going to talk about glucose first. So again, these are the healthy brains of elderly people. I am pointing out that these brains have some sensors in them. Notice where those red arrows went to, pointing that these brains have some hot spots in them. What's going on in those hot spots is we tagged that glucose for energy. And as we look at those brains inside these elderly people, again, these patients were between 68 and 80 years old. And I think it's worthy of noting that they weren't overweight. Their body mass index was 26, healthy being a normal weight, but their elderly body was not obese. They were not overweight. So again, not like Lachlan, who's had high sugars and has been struggling with her weight for several years because of her type 1 diabetes. These are elderly brains, and these are the healthy people. They did not test positive for any of those memory problems. Notice those red spots, because that's going to be really important as we go through these next two pictures. What I'm pointing out here is those are the areas that are burning really hot for using glucose. Again, you'll notice that that's the prefrontal cortex. Maybe you don't notice that. Prefrontal cortex is the part right behind your forehead. And these are the advanced areas that our brain uses to really, separate us from every other being on the planet. Those parts of our brain burn glucose, and we can do more advanced skills with our brains than any other living being on planet Earth. So looking at that prefrontal cortex, that's where a lot of that glucose goes. Now watch closely as I show you what happened with memory problems. So now you can see a little less of that glucose is positive and there's more yellow. Now there's even some areas that have green as the way they're representing their energy. The green energy means that they're on the lower spectrum for burning glucose. Remember, these people have mild memory problems. I'm just going to show you that one more time. I'm going to go back to healthy brains. Now watch carefully what happens with the red and the yellow as I move forward. That red gets a little lighter and the yellow gets to be more prominent with those mild memory problems. I know that's subtle, but just hang in there. I'm going to drive this point home. Let's move on now to the people who have Alzheimer's. Again, they're between 68 and 80 years old and they're not fat. Now look at how much of that brain is green. Again, a very low area. There's even a little bit of blue there that says it's incredibly hungry for energy. These elderly people have low glucose, low delivery for the energy the brain is asking for. You could in many ways say that these Alzheimer's brains are hungry. Their cells are asking for glucose. They're burning very low glucose because their brain is resistant to it. And we know that many times Alzheimer's is called type 3 diabetes because of how it's not efficiently using glucose for energy anymore. It needs help. All right, hang in there with me. This is where this gets interesting. Now we're going to switch to the use of ketones. Again, these ketones are burning energy for fuel, and we know that those energy ketones are going to be longer acting, and they are, again, you can't make them in the brain. You had to pull them from the circulation into the body. So here are those same healthy brains. Again, our elderly people, not overweight. Healthy brains, they tested normal on their memory tests. And these people had ketones floating in their circulation for 4 to 6 weeks. They go into the scanner and they look at the areas of the brain that are using that are using ketones. So look at the yellow and the green in these healthy brains of these elderly people who have normal memory tests, but look how much of their brain is using ketones. Only a couple little ditzels there for the blue areas, which would be a very low amount of energy coming from ketones. Now watch carefully what happens when I show you what happens with the mild memory problems. Mild memory problems now turn into more yellow and less green. So now there's a higher percentage of their brain burning ketones. Again, when we compare these brains to the ones who had normal memory, we see that several of the cells in their mind, in their brain, have turned up the resources for burning ketones. This is a huge but subtle finding. And then I want you to compare it to what happens to those who have Alzheimer's. And that is where you'll see that there are red areas in the Alzheimer's brains seeking a very high level of ketone burning in their brain. This is an incredible issue that I hope I can drive home to those people looking at this online, and remembering that brains have specific rules. Now we've got the most diseased brains, this Alzheimer brain, and it is using a very intense and high level of ketones. Well, why would it do that? All right, so here's just a look of all of those scans together. I just want you to carefully look at the column where the glucose was the ones on the left, and the ketones are the ones over on the right. And the healthy brains had some hot spots for glucose, but it had some moderate to low ketone burning, meaning it used ketones, but it wasn't really as intense as what happens when the memory problems got worse. The brain started recruiting more and more cells to step up its production of ketones. By the time you get to Alzheimer's, again, these are institutionalized Alzheimer's disease patients, very advanced brain diseases, and look at how many, look at that lower right-hand corner where there are red spots for that Alzheimer's disease. I think just to drive it home, I want to make sure that you see that the brains that were starving for fuel, they had widespread ketone burning. They had yellow and green everywhere with some spots of red. Their brains, as much as we've called them disease, as much as we've said this Alzheimer's brain isn't working very well, they are institutionalized. They cannot take care of themselves. There is a hidden message here that when their brains cannot satisfy the energy that is needed because it has been using glucose only for such a long time, that transition isn't mandatory. There are options for these patients' brains. So, all right. So these folks in that study, they didn't just wake up one day in ketosis. We supplemented and put ketones into their body. They were really good at putting glucose into their brain. At all 3 ages, all of them used glucose for fuel. Without that, people die, so they did a good job. But there was a difference. As the brains weren't working well, they couldn't match the needs of the energy for the brain's, the demand the brain was putting on the energy. When we added ketones, the little receptor that keeps kind of as sleepy if you haven't had any ketones in your circulation, we woke it up by just giving the patients supplements of a ketogenic diet, or of BHB, that's called Ketones in a Can is what I call them. And we turned on that receptor that takes it out of the circulation and puts it into the brain. After that brain has been exposed, we found that the brain actually preferred to use ketones over the glucose. Ketones were sparing the brain glucose uptake. So as we were looking at those two receptors, which ones were more efficient at fueling the brain? As the ketones were increasing, we saw that the ketone receptor right there at that blood-brain barrier was more efficiently taking the ketones out of circulation and putting them into the brain. This process was in trade for as much glucose, meaning it wasn't that, we were throwing glucose into the brain and it was just happened to be that ketones were there. The brain was preferring the ketones over the glucose. And that's something that I didn't know. Now, this slide is a little intense, but I do want you to see that this is, again, studying people who are looking at a ketogenic, the ketone that bridges the brain gap. But this is for fuel. So that white bar in the back is the brain energy. And again, these are all our same folks that were from those scans. They are between 68 and 80 years old. And actually, the first column is young, healthy control group. The second column are the ones who are 68 to 80 years old, and they have no memory problems. As you look, though, the demands and energy for the young adults, they were able to supply their brains with 100% of their energy. Only 5% of their brain was using ketones, so they had no deficits in what they needed. As we moved on to the older folks who did not have memory problems, they were able to meet their brain energy needs with glucose, but they still had a few percentage points that they used ketones to fuel their brain with. As we now move into people who had just the mild memory problems, this is not Alzheimer's, these are the mild memory problems, we see that they're barely meeting the demands for their brain, that just a smidgen over that white line, that ketone gets them there. And they're struggling. They are really struggling to meet the demands for their brain. We start supplementing. In this case, we used MCT for their ketones. But as we added 30 grams of MCT and then 45 grams of MCT, their energy fuel for their brain improved. And so did their test scores. Their brain was able to not just pull those glucose molecules from the circulation, but also when the ketones were floating around in their circulation. And again, you can test these at home. You can test your glucose with a glucose monitor. You can test your ketones with a ketone monitor. And the higher they got their ketones in a ketogenic state, the longer they did that, the better their brain was able to perform on those tests. All right,
Please subscribe to my channel. And don't forget to click the notification bell so you don't miss out on any new videos. Stay tuned.